Welcome to part 2 of our terminology introduction. Today we'll be covering what makes terminology and terminology standards so difficult to use. Healthcare terminology standards are definitely something that's needed to help improve the way we work with healthcare data. As Taiichi Ono, who was the father of the Toyota production system, said, without standards, there can be no improvement. But the flip side of that is, as Andrew Tannenbaum said, the nice thing about standards is that you have so many of them to choose from. To that end, we can take a look at a few. This is just a small few of the terminology standards that are used within the U.S. And you can see here that we have SNOMED CT, which the international release is available from the National Library of Medicine in the U.S., and it's released in January and July, but just recently they've started to do monthly updates to that. And as we can see, it's in a proprietary tabs limited text format that's specific to SNOMED CT. And then on top of that, you have the SNOMED CT US extensions, and those are only released in March and September. And again, that's in a tabs limited, the same format as SNOMED. So from that standpoint, you have a similar format that you can easily use. But then we get to LOINC, and LOINC is released by Regenstrief in February and August, and it's distributed in a totally different release format. So you have all of these different clinical terminologies that are maintained and released at various points in times by various organizations, and in different formats. So they're not necessarily the exact same release format. So you have to deal with different release files, inputting that into whatever systems you're using. Official releases are typically done through a national release center. So, for example, in the UK, the United Kingdom, there are releases that are done through the NHS Digital. In the US, on the flip side, there are some, and most of the terminologies that are available through the National Library of Medicine's Unified Medical Language System, or the UMLS. However, those tend to be delayed based on the release schedule. So typically a SNOMED release will come out each month, so it may be delayed in the next UMLS. It's not immediately released in the same time that it's released from SNOMED. So you can have a delay there. So in some cases, it may be easier to get them from the distributing organization. In addition to being separate releases, separate formats, you do have some semantic overlap between the different terminologies. So there are some concepts that exist in both places with different codes, and there's little to no mapping or integration done between the various terminologies. And in some cases, that's something that you have to do yourself. An example of that would be here, as we've shown, 41995-2, which is hemoglobin A1C, mass, volume, and blood from LOINC. It has different parts that make up that LOINC code, and those different parts could be represented in SNOMED as concepts. So, for example, the glycated hemoglobin A1C has a code in SNOMED that could be used to represent that component. Mass concentration has a property, and that could be represented as a SNOMED concept as well. So each of these pieces could be represented as SNOMED concepts, and there's definitely overlap there. And these codes in LOINC themselves could be given parents within SNOMED that would easily make them integrated, and you could use them seamlessly in your systems. Luckily, there's been a lot of work with SNOMED and LOINC over the last year or two to produce this integration file. So there's some good news on that front, and from a SNOMED LOINC perspective, that's going to be harmonized, and you could easily use SNOMED and LOINC together and move back and forth between one and the other. Other terminologies that's still an ongoing thing. Healthcare IT and software applications require the use of these various terminologies, and in a lot of cases, having them seamlessly work together would make it much easier to use. But if you were to do that yourself, that's a very labor intensive process to go through and try to map each of those pieces to each other. And in a lot of cases, there's not a one-to-one match. There's some ambiguity between the two terminologies, and you have to choose the best case scenario. But one thing that can be done to help ease the use of multiple terminologies is to try to find some common representation, some common format that you're going to implement within your system to represent all of the various terminologies that you need to use. There's been some work on that in the past. In 2020, in 2021, there was a work at HL7 on a standard terminology knowledge base, which they called Tinker. And that was released as a informative document in 2021 that would give some guidance on a representation that could be used to represent things like SNOMED, LOINC, RX norm, various ICD, and so on in a common format that could easily represent all the different components that make up those terminologies. There are a variety of ways to work with clinical terminology data once you've collected all the different terminologies you need to use. That has evolved as the medical field has matured. It kind of starts with basic tools that you can pick up and use to begin to work with data depending on your skill set. There's different ways you can work with the data. So let's talk about a few of the different types of solutions that are available today to allow you to visualize and start to work and implement terminology within your systems. The first and most simplest tool that you could use to begin to work with terminology data would be something like a text editor or Excel spreadsheets, or even a simple Microsoft Access database could be used here. And this would allow you to easily open and browse and maybe do some quick and easy things with terminology. It's good for simple, small terminologies, things like CVX vaccine codes would be a good way to do this. You could do some small things with maybe some reference sets or value sets from SNOMED using Microsoft Excel or something like that. A lot of novice users are very familiar and comfortable using things like Microsoft Excel. So it could be a good way to display that to them to allow them to browse and view things. But if you're trying to do any editing or difficult things, it's prone to errors. But again, it's easy for some users to use Excel just to do a quick review or something like that. The next option would be to load your terminology into a database. If a user is very comfortable browsing terminologies or querying and updating using databases, this is a good option. Obviously, if you're going to try to implement terminology within a system, you would need to load that terminology into some kind of database in order to get it into a format that you would want. As mentioned earlier, each terminology has a different data format and would therefore require different database load scripts. And while this seems like a simple solution, the challenges arise quickly, and not all terminologies continue to maintain the same structure. Their structures change over time. They may modify things, so having to constantly update database load scripts can become difficult over time. Adding the need to query across multiple versions of each component within each terminology, all of the different complexities that are inherent within terminologies themselves, it becomes increasingly difficult as you go along. West Coast Informatics has elected to make freely available SNOMED CT load scripts that allows you to run SQL queries against the latest versions of SNOMED. So you can access that through our website and freely download and use these scripts with each international and US edition of SNOMED. Probably the most useful way to implement and start to use terminology would be to get access to a terminology server. And terminology servers tend to have browsers that are associated with them as well. So terminology servers, APIs are software that's dedicated to maintaining clinical terminology and making it available to systems. While these servers support system-to-system communication, such as providing concept information associated with given terminology codes, these servers also usually are paired with some kind of front-end user interface that allows you to search, view, and browse terminology and its components in a web browser. And in some cases, it does have some editing capabilities provided as well. There are many terminology servers available with various capabilities, and we'll go over a number of examples of each that's available today by the standard terminology organizations. So let's first talk about terminology browsers. The terminology browsers allow you to search, view, and browse terminology, and in some cases do some minor editing. Although in the case of the browsers that come directly from the standards development organizations, you're probably not going to be able to do any editing. You may have some ability to make suggestions for edits, but you're probably not going to be able to do any direct editing. So let's look at one of these browsers. Probably the more popular one here is SNOMED CT's browser, which you can get at browser.ihtsdotools.org. And it can give you access to multiple different versions or editions of SNOMED. So you can view, for example, the Estonian edition of SNOMED, and you can change between different versions here. And you can perform searches, click on a concept, view its details, view its parents and children, and all of the different pieces of that concept that are distributed by SNOMED in that edition. Many terminology servers also include a browser that allow you to view multiple terminologies at once depending on what they have loaded. So if we look at our terminology server Term Hub, we have the ability to go into the browser, and depending on what I have loaded here, in this case I have allergy, ICD-10, CM, LOINC, RxNorm, and SNOMED CT, I can search for penicillin, and I can see a LOINC code. If I expand the results here, I can see SNOMED CT, and here's some RxNorm codes for results that have penicillin in them. So I have quite a range of different concepts, and I can view each one. So I have a common way of representing LOINC and use a similar method to represent SNOMED as well. So I have a common format for displaying both terminologies. In addition, these terminology servers provide an API which is used to connect a computer or software to the terminology server so that that terminology can then be utilized. So very similar functionality that we displayed there on the browser is available through the API so that you can search, pull back relevant concept details that you need to display within your systems. There are terminology specific APIs that the standards development organizations put out. For example, LOINC has a FHIR API that you can have a free login and access it. SNOMED CT has a free API as well, and so does RxNorm. But then when you look at terminology servers that are put out by terminology vendors like West Coast Informatics, we provide our Term Hub product that does have an API that you can connect to and do similar functionality that the other terminology specific APIs provide you. In addition, there's some other National Cancer Institute enterprise vocabulary services. They have terminology tools as well that have an API that you can connect to. So there's various terminology agnostic APIs that are out there. And if you would like to get access to the browser or the API for Terminology Hub or Term Hub, you can access that here at www.terminologyhub.com. There are also various natural language processing APIs that are available that take free text and extract medical concepts and map them to specified clinical terminologies. For example, you can use Google Healthcare's natural language API or something like Amazon Comprehend Medical, and I have their link up here. You can see they have in for SNOMED and for RxNorm and for ICD-10-CM. So you can pass in free text and it will extract SNOMED concepts for that. And this can be very useful if you have that free text that you're trying to use in some way. You can map that using these natural language processing APIs. So as we talked about in this presentation, working with a single clinical terminology contains its own complexities and challenges. Adding in the need to work across multiple different clinical terminologies with different release schedules, different release formats, overlapping content in most cases, it necessitates the need to work with specialized software, specialized APIs and browsers that allows you to load all those various terminologies, make them available when they need to be available, and identify the overlaps and eliminate those for you so that you can seamlessly use terminology within your systems. If you would like to, please visit our products page to find out more about the clinical terminology utilities we offer. Thanks for attending this presentation and viewing it. We have at least one more planned in the coming weeks and months, and we hope you continue to find all of this interesting and informative.